How's it going, Eliminators? Today we're going to be continuing our video series on the 4x4 snowblower. We're going to be replacing the friction wheel as well as the lower drive axle bushings. So let's get right into it. It does look like the friction wheel is a little worn down here. There isn't a ton of rubber left on that. So we are going to go ahead and change that. Okay, so I've removed the 4 3/8 bolts from the side cover here, and if we look at this system, it's essentially just a lever. So up on your handles you're going to see that little trigger, and when you pull that trigger it pulls this lever back, and what that does is it allows the right side of the snowblower to go into basically a freewheel mode. So if you think of this like a tank, basically with the right side in freewheel, only your left side is going to be propelling you forward and it's going to turn you to the right. It's a very simple design, and if you remember from part 1, this was kind of sticking. So what I can do is tilt this upside down and I can go in there and lubricate that cable and then pull the trigger over and over again, move that back and forth to get that cable nice and lubricated. So that'll take care of that, and I can repeat the steps on the left side as well. But here's where we're at now. So this axle down here also has 2 little bushings, and check this out. That is completely ovaled out, and I don't have this bushing, and it's not the same as the other ones. I should have thought of this, but I'm in no rush to get this snowblower fixed. This is kind of just a little project that I've been working on the side. Once I take that other side off, I'm going to inspect it, but I'll probably end up ordering 2 of these bushings here. Now, interestingly enough, you guys can see hex flange bearing, bushing, whatever they want to call it. But notice how the manual here on the parts diagram lists it as a 714. That's actually going to be a typo. So the part number is a 741. I don't see this too often, but occasionally you run into this, and that's why I always like to double check my part numbers before I go ahead and order them. But if you weren't careful, you could have ordered that number and it could have been a completely different part. So you always want to be double checking your part numbers. Now, like I said, we are going to be replacing the friction wheel as well, and that friction wheel axle runs off of bearings on either side. And if we come in here and wiggle that friction wheel axle, there's absolutely no play in that bearing, and there isn't any play on the bearing on this side either. So just like the right side, I removed the left side panel, and if we take the bushing off here, we're going to see that this one is not that bad. It's starting to oval out just a bit, but if we actually check the play, there's not a whole lot. But I ordered 2 just for the sake of, replacing both of them so that they wear evenly. They were $7.30 a piece, so I figured I might as well order 2, and then I can just keep this one as a spare. As for the friction wheel, we come up here, and if I pull off the bearing here, you're going to see it's pretty greasy, pretty wet with the penetrating oil that we were using above, but there's no side-to-side play, and there's no grinding or binding when I roll this. It rolls nice and smoothly. So this is a good bearing, and I'm assuming that they were replaced at the same time because this one looks to be the same bearing. So with the bearing on the left removed, the axle now has play on it. I've just disconnected it from the shifter linkage here. I can now pull the axle directly out from the bearing on this side, and then I should have enough room to slip the sprocket off there. So that was very simple. By removing the bearing on the left side, you don't have to remove the E-clip from the axle. So that allows you to just pull the axle straight out. And the only thing I took note of was the position of the sprocket. The hub goes on the left, and then this spacer goes on the right. I just looped the chain down there, and I should be able to just simply slide this out now, kind of like that. And then we can put that down out of the way, and I now have access at our friction wheel assembly. Now, I used my Milwaukee to get the 3 3/8 bolts out on that side. Had to use a wrench to get the ones on the inside because there's not a lot of room to get in there. But once you get both sides free, you should be able to just split these 2 hubs apart here, and then I can go ahead and just replace the center rubber ring. So those 2 plates hold that rubber ring in place. Now, MTD does give you 2 little cutouts on either side of the plate so that you can get in there and pry it off. So there's our friction wheel, and that simply just pops off, and we can go ahead and install a brand new one on there that isn't worn down as flat as this one. And if you guys want to know what the part number is, if we look on the diagram, we can see that the friction wheel is a number 8. So we flip over to our second page, and I've marked it here. Number 8 is a 684-0042B, and that is a friction wheel assembly. Now that part number there is going to be for the entire assembly, so you're going to get the friction wheel installed with this whole thing. So it also includes this bearing here at the back, and they could be like $150 all the way up to like $200 depending on where you're going to get it. But we only want the friction wheel itself. So we have a Stens 240-991, and your MTD friction wheel part number just for the friction wheel itself is going to be a 935-0243B. So that's going to get you just the rubber disc. And I just wanted to quickly show you guys the difference in material. Almost a 1/4 inch on either side. So that's like a 1/2 inch difference. And just like new tires, they do have a little ring on there, but that'll wear off and then you get down to the larger portion of it. So it's going to be a big difference in grip. And I know you guys are probably getting tired of hearing me say this, but I've also applied quite a bit of Permatex nickel anti-seize to the friction wheel axle just on the far right side, and that's because this sprocket, you guys can see that it's grooved in here, and this fits on that hex shaft, and then it's going to drop into place just like that. So if this axle ever has to get removed in the future to do a friction wheel replacement, then I don't want this sprocket to seize on there, because if it seizes on there, then you have to disconnect the chain, and it's a lot more work than simply just sliding the axle out and having everything just drop down. So now that it's anti-seized, I don't have to worry about it seizing up onto that shaft. And I also put a little bit on the end where it goes into the bearing, and I'll do that on the other side before I slip that bearing in. And I also went ahead and used some anti-seize on all the 6 bolts for the friction wheel disc as well, just so that, you know, same thing, nothing seizes up, everything will come apart nice and easily. So I put my friction wheel in horizontally and then rotated it up vertically, put my axle in just onto the friction wheel, and I've shifted it into, like, I think 4th gear, and I'm going to just go ahead and pop in this guy right here, just like that, and then I can go ahead and slide the shaft over. I just kept sliding the axle over, pop the sprocket on, and the chain just popped in. Everything's kind of loose, so you can move stuff around. It's super easy. And like always, a little bit of nickel anti-seize on that end of the axle for this bearing to make sure that that doesn't seize, because we have to remember that this whole disassembly was super simple because this bearing simply popped right out, and I was able to just pull everything out from one side. So if the bearing's inner race here was seized to the friction wheel shaft, all of this would have been much more difficult. And just for reference, if you guys wanted to order those bearings, they were a 7410600. So I got my new bushings in here. That's an MTD hex flange bushing, and the inside diameter is 0.564. So we're going to go ahead and simply just replace these bushings. I've applied quite a bit of Permatex nickel anti-seize to the axle, and you want to make sure that you have that washer in between this and your new bushing, and I have the bushing installed on the other side. So before I go to put these caps on, I wanted to take a look at the cables, and I want to shoot some lubricant down the tube, because I know that the little finger triggers up top were kind of sticking a little bit. So you guys can see here that it kind of returns a little slowly. So a little bit of PB Blaster. I've gone ahead and sprayed it inside of the cable at the bottom here, and I'm going to spray some down the cable right in there as well with the machine flipped up, and then gravity will help take that lubricant down the cable. And just a little bit of lubricant goes a long way, because you're going to see that already that's returning very quickly. I've done the same thing for the right side as well. And then before I go ahead and take these covers and bolt them onto the sides of this machine here, I'm going to be taking some black graphite spray. This is quick dry graphite lubricant, and we're going to be spraying it all over this little cogged piece here. Now don't worry about getting oil or grease on your friction plate or your friction wheel. Once we go ahead and get these covers installed, before we go ahead and reinstall our access panel, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the friction plate and the friction wheel with some oil and grease remover. So right now I'm just going to reinstall the covers. And yes, I used nickel anti-seize on all of the bolts. So now that our new bushings are installed, you guys can see the right side. That was the one that was the worst, and now it's nice and snug. So when we go to check the movement, there's absolutely no play whatsoever. And that's what you want. So I'm going to clean up the friction plate. So taking the Scotch-Brite pad to the friction plate cleans things up nicely. You guys can see we're starting to get a nice shine on there. Now, there's going to be some areas that are going to be hard to get, so we're just going to go ahead and shift the machine into reverse so that I can get at the left side. Now it's in reverse, and we can go ahead and get at all of the nasty stuff that's built up on this plate. So we're just going to wear off all of that. You don't have to take a Scotch-Brite pad to the friction plate, but I like to because it cleans it up real nice. I want to make sure that my shifter axle is lubricated. So I'm going to be using some low temp grease. We're going to grease that up. Okay, so now the shifter shaft has been lubricated properly with low temperature grease. You guys want to make sure you're running a low temp grease. I have a little bit of oil and grease remover, and I'm just going to go ahead and wipe down the friction plate here, make sure that it's nice and clean and that none of the release all or grease or anti-seize that we were using on this job is going to interfere with how this machine is going to drive. And it's interesting to see that they don't have their own proprietary friction wheel. And what I mean by that is, even though this is a 4x4 snowblower, it's operated the same way that a two-wheeled snowblower is, using one single standard MTD friction wheel. I would have much rather have seen them run a much wider friction wheel. I think that would have been a little more interesting, give it a little bit more bite, but they opted to go with this. So, you know, you have four wheels, you're going to be putting more pressure on your friction wheel. I could see these 4x4 units wearing out a friction wheel faster than a two-wheel drive, because at the end of the day, you're turning more wheels and you're creating more force and more wear on that standard friction wheel. So I'll just wipe down the rest of the plate here. So the underside of this machine has been completely serviced. The friction wheel has been replaced. All of the bushings have been replaced, not only in the chain boxes outside, but also the upper axle bushings and the lower axle bushings. Basically everything's serviced here. There should be absolutely no issues with the drive system. So now I'm just going to reinstall the service panel, and that wraps up part 3 of the video series. If you want to continue with the 4x4 snowblower video series, be sure to stay tuned for part 4, where we reinstall the chain boxes, get the wheels put on it, and finally take it for a drive. So that's it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed it, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You guys can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week, check channel out for new content, and as always guys, thanks for watching.